By the beginning of the second week of the semester, my university students are well aware of the fact that if they commit the cardinal sin of the academy, their names will be written in the book of the damned. That cardinal sin being plagiarism, of using someone else's research and writing as if it were their own. Another term for it is cheating. One student, a young man who flaunted my attendance policy and showed little interest in the course, turned in a midterm essay 6 weeks into the term, an essay of such brilliance and superb writing that I asked him to come and see me. Thinking he would be congratulated for his wonderful work, he smilingly entered my office. He beamed brightly when I told him that I marveled at his essay. That is, until I showed him the copy I had made of the lengthy paragraph he wrote with his own hand on the first week of the term, a paragraph of monumental incoherence, botched grammar, and poor spelling. I then asked him how he had made such amazing improvement in a scant 5 weeks. Well, to say the least, the jig was up. He was caught and thankfully, tearfully repentant, with the promise that there would be no plagiarism ever again. Don't fool the professor. Such was not the case in the ancient world of Jesus and Paul. To copy someone else's work or to use their name as one's own was a common and legal practice. And so we know now from the labor of biblical scholars that the historical Paul, the Paul who experienced a conversion on the road to Damascus, established Christian communities, and was martyred in Rome, the historical Paul created only seven letters that were included in the New Testament. The letter to Philemon, our second reading, being one of them. Other authors, writing after the death of Paul, claim Paul as the author of their letters that either revised or contradicted the writings of the historical Paul. These writers, of course, knew of Paul's fame and thus wanted to capitalize on his fame by using his name even as they endeavored to tone down or reject what was his revolutionary teaching. For instance, in the historical Paul's letter to the Galatians, he clearly states that in Christian baptism, the patriarchy of his culture is washed away. Women and men are fundamentally equal in Christ, something unheard of in the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean, in which a woman was viewed either as property or was considered a second-class citizen who had to obey her father, her husband, and her son. But there's more. At the end of his letter to the Romans, the historical Paul spends considerable time praising women as leaders in the Christian movement, praising them as apostles, preachers, evangelists, church planters, as hosts for the community, and thus as leaders at the Lord's Supper. I mean, any Roman male raised into the gender roles of imperial society would be utterly horrified by this practice and view it as either foolhardy or subversive. As one Roman governor said of women leaders and their Christian congregations, they are a contagion that needs to be quarantined and cured before it spreads any further. And yet, if we read the first letter to Timothy, said to be written by Paul, but actually written by another author, upset with the historical Paul, we hear these words: "Let a woman learn in silence and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. She is to keep silent." Well, let's be clear. An apostle, an evangelist, a preacher, a church planter, a president at the Lord's table is not going to be silent nor submissive. Thus, we discern in this letter to Timothy, written 50 years after Paul's death, considerable anxiety over Paul's clear intent to subvert and establish cultural bias and practice. But that was not all. Jesus and Paul lived in an imperial Roman economy, an economy dependent on slave labor. Indeed, every city in the empire had a slave market, and by some estimates, 20% of the population was enslaved, 1 in every 5 persons. Writing in the late 50s, some 20 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, Paul asks Philemon to release Onesimus, a fellow Christian, to release him from the bonds of slavery. Clearly, Onesimus was owned by Philemon, but for the historical Paul, there can be no slavery among Christians, for this demeaning and deathly practice was and is washed away in the waters of baptism. I appeal to you on the basis of love, writes Paul, to release Onesimus, who Paul refers to so tenderly as his own heart. No to slavery, writes Paul, for slavery is the objectification of a human being created in the image of a loving and liberating God. And yet, if we read the letter to the Colossians, a letter thought to be written by Paul, but in fact written by another author toward the end of the first century, we hear this: "Slaves, obey your earthly masters. Obey them in everything." A clear rejection of the historical Paul's insistence on freedom from slavery. Now, we might imagine that the concern of the historical Paul to end slavery, at least among Christians, is a thing of the past. I mean, it's illegal, isn't it? And yet the exploitation of human beings is far from ended. Seattle is a major center of human trafficking on the West Coast. Many of the clothes we wear are produced in overseas sweatshops or by Los Angeles garment workers, mostly women, mostly immigrant women, who are paid less than a minimum wage. And then there is debt bondage, the use of high interest rates to keep one in perpetual servitude to a predatory lender. And this summer, just a few months ago, a Midwestern congressman introduced a bill in the House of Representatives to loosen child labor laws. To loosen child labor laws. In all seriousness, the promoter of this bill said this: "I want young kids to experience the reward of hard work." Dear friends, the historical Paul is the patron of this house, this parish. His searing critique of cultural patriarchy, of slavery in many forms, and economic injustice forms his legacy a legacy of which you and I are the inheritors, a legacy that flows from the waters of the pool that marks the entry to this house, this church. Thus, I say, to dip our fingers in that pool and trace the sign of the cross over our hearts is to renew our commitment to live into that legacy in a time sadly and tragically marked by cruelty and corruption at the highest levels of government. And yet here in this place, in this house, we may join Paul in his prayer, "O Christ, refresh our hearts." Yes, refresh our hearts, confident that we share in a power greater than any predator, any tyrant, any bully. Yes, I say, let us touch that living, life-giving, and liberating water, and then let it flow through us into God's wounded, yet beloved world.